Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to talk about the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles of the brain are a network of interconnected cavities responsible for the production and the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. They include two lateral ventricles and a third ventricle and a fourth ventricle with a number of interconnected channels. So the first two of the ventricles are known as the lateral ventricles. As you look at the picture, each lateral ventricle is a C-shaped structure that consists of a body, the central portion of which lying in the parietal lobe, connected to three cones or horns. We have a right and a left lateral ventricle and only a single third and fourth ventricle. Back to the lateral ventricle. The body of the lateral ventricle has got a roof made up by the corpus callosum, looking at the model here. So this is the right and this is the left lateral ventricle. The corpus callosum has been cut here, but it makes up the roof. Medially we have the septum pellucidum, and once we remove the corpus callosum, you can see now the roof is here. The middle wall made by the septum pellucidum lies here. The floor is made up by the anterior part of the body of the fornix, the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle, the dorsolateral aspect of the two thalami, and part of the caudate nucleus. The two lateral ventricles are interconnected by the interventricular foramen of Monro. Looking at the model here, it lies anterior to the body. Looking at the model, we have a right and a left. Interventricular foramen lies just behind the anterior pillars of the fornix. And in front of the interventricular foramen, we have the anterior horn or cornu. The body of the lateral ventricle is connected by a wide area known as the atrium to the posterior or occipital horn and the inferior or temporal horn. The posterior horn or the occiput lies within the parenchyma of the occipital lobe, and again it has a roof made by the splenium of the body of the corpus callosum, and the remainder of the wall is made of parenchyma of the occipital lobe. Now pay attention, this is the most important part of the lateral ventricle. The inferior horn or the temporal one has a roof made by parenchyma of the temporal lobe, and the medial wall and inferior wall are made up by the hippocampal structures, and the amygdaloid structure is at the anterior end of the temporal horn. The choroid plexus is the part responsible for the production of the CSF within the ventricular system. And regarding the lateral ventricles, the choroid plexus exists only in the floor of the central portion, as you may see here, the red part, and only in the inferior horn. The anterior and posterior horns contain no choroid plexus. Now, the second component of the ventricular system is the third ventricle. The two interventricular foramen connect the two lateral ventricles with the third ventricle. And looking at the model, the third ventricle is just a very thin vertical slit within diencephalon. Superiorly, the roof is made up by the fornix, the choroid plexus, the same structures that compose the floor of the lateral ventricle. Anteriorly, it's bound by the optic chiasm and the anterior commissure. Posteriorly, it's bounded by the pineal gland and the habenular commissure. And inferior of the floor is made up by the infundibulum. The infundibulum is the part that connects the mammillary bodies, the hypoalphysis, with the superior part of the midbrain. And there's a small cavity, if you look here, this is a space for the passage of the interthalamic connection. Now we have the two lateral walls of the third ventricle are made up by the thalamus and hypothalamus. And there's a small grey matter band that connects the two thalami that crosses the cavity of the third ventricle. The third ventricle is connected to the last component of the ventricular system, the fourth ventricle, via the aqueduct of Sylvius, or known as the cerebral aqueduct. The fourth ventricle is a diamond-shaped cavity. Looking at the model, this is the fourth ventricle. Anteriorly, we have the pons and the upper medulla oblongata, and posteriorly, we have the cerebellum. Looking at the picture, this is the cavity of the fourth ventricle. This is the anterior boundary, and this is the posterior boundary. It has got a roof made up by the superior cerebellar peduncles and the anterior and posterior medullary vela. And there is an extension of the roof, known as the fastigium, towards the cerebellum. The floor is known as the rhomboid fossa. And downward, the fourth ventricle continues with the central spinal canal. As you look at the model, the central spinal canal is here. And there are two lateral extensions, or known as the lateral recesses. The CSF leaves the ventricular system only at the level of the fourth ventricle, and it does that via a pair of lateral openings known as the foramen of Luschka and a central or median foramen, which is largest, known as the foramen of Megendie. Looking at this picture, the lateral apertures are located slightly superior to the median aperture. The median aperture is found in the roof. The CSF now leaves the ventricular system by these two openings into the subarachnoid space, where it flows into localized expansions known as the cisterns. So the median aperture of Megendie flows into the cistern magna. And there are several subarachnoid spaces and cisterns you need to remember for yourself. You need to know that the CSF now leaves the subarachnoid space into the venous sinuses via protrusions of the arachnoid into the venous sinuses, known as the arachnoid villi and the arachnoid granulations.